G'day language teachers! Since we are done discussing about word processing, now let us go deeper and jump into our new topic, which is about sentence processing. Before we proceed to our discussions, let us identify first our intended learning outcomes. So first we have to define sentence processing, then second to differentiate garden path-based model and constraint-based model of syntactic parsing, and then the third is to express insights on the importance of sentence processing in our day-to-day sentence construction. Now let us define first sentence processing. When we say sentence processing, it is a subfield of psycholinguistics focusing on the interpretation of the sentences. This is according to COCAL 2018. Now, comprehension can be confined into the following central aspects: the sentence analysis, sentence understanding, that is assignment of meaning and withdrawing of inferences. Then there is a step of working out the linguistic category of the input string into a process known as parsing. So what is parsing? Parsing means to break down a sentence into its component parts so that the meaning of a sentence can be understood. And this can either be the category of words such as nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, or other elements such as the tenses of verb, the present, past, or the future. To understand more about sentence processing or sentence interpretation and how it affects the context of a sentence, let's have an example of the organization of words into phrases and how it affects the meaning of the sentence. So say for example the sentence, Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. This sentence could be organized in at least two distinct ways, and the way it is organized determines what it means. Here our likely intended meaning happens when the reader treats the prepositional phrase with Rush Limbaugh as closely related to the verb discussed. Now the meaning would fall out the following conversation. Who did Dr. Phil have on his radio this morning? He had Rush Limbaugh on the show. And what did he talk about? They talk about sex. So Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. Now another way of organizing the sentence is to treat the prepositional phrase with Rush Limbaugh as being closely related to the noun sex. The other meaning can emerge from this conversation. Who did Dr. Phil have sex with? Dr. Phil had sex with Rush Limbaugh. I don't believe you. Really, he talked about it afterwards. Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. So to illustrate the different ways we could organize words, we could use a phrase structure tree or a tree diagram. So notice in the illustration that the structure is labeled and the labels are called the nodes. We call it the nodes, the verb phrase, noun phrase, and the subject. And the connection between the nodes are called the branches. As you can see in the structure tree, there are several ways that we can build a structure out of the interpretation from the sentence, Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. So there is an illustration to show how it looks like in the structure tree. So notice the difference between the two structure. So sentence processing is more than just figuring out which words go together to make phrases, but it also deals about the mental processes that people use in interpreting ambiguous sentences. Now, one basic question in this field of study is, are ambiguous sentences harder to process than the less ambiguous ones with the same meaning? The answer is yes. Ambiguity leads to longer reading times, lower comprehension accuracy, and different patterns of brain activity. So language scientists have been looking at some specific set of processes that people actually use when they parse sentences. Now, there are at least two known models of parsing sentences. We have first the garden path theory or the two-stage model, and the second is the constraint-based model. Now let us go deeper into this type of parsing theories. Let us examine the garden path theory. Fraser's garden path theory is considered a two-stage model of syntactic parsing because it proposes that parsing takes place in two distinct processes or stages. First is the analyzing of the incoming sequence of words to determine what the category of words it belongs, such as it belongs to the part of speech, the nouns, verbs, adjectives, and so on. Then after categorizing, the parser will now build a syntactic structure for the sequence. Take note that in this model of parsing, there is no other information besides the word category that is used in the initial structure building process. Its main focus is on the categories presented in the input. Now, we have here the illustration of a garden path theory by Matthew Traxler. So as you can see, how the garden path theory operates. So in the process, the lexical processor identifies the category presented in the input, and its output is processed into syntactic parsing. So that is the figure 4.1. Then the parser will now build a syntactic structure for the string of categories and then assign the positions of word in the tree. Then it will now be subjective to thematic interpreter, whose job is to apply the set of rules that assigns the rules to each of the element in the syntactic tree based on their positions and how they are connected to the other words. So for example, the subject of the sentence are being treated as the given information and it is the initiator of the action in the clause. So the process continues. Now, if the thematic interpreter produces meaning that makes sense and is consistent with the listener's prior knowledge or assumption and can really be integrated with the preceding sentence in the discourse, then the process of interpreting the sentence ends and the listener can now move to the next one. However, if the thematic interpretation lacks one or more of the qualities, so one solution is to signal the syntactic parser to find an alternative structure for the sequence of words. Okay, there are two main points to remember in garden path theory. First, the garden path theory assumes that people can only build one syntactic structure at a time. Second, the garden path theory says the predominant principle that the parser relies on is simplicity. So, the parser will seek to build the less complicated structure that it can. The classic version of garden path theory operates in the procedure of the minimal attachment and the late closure. So minimal attachment says, build the simplest structure consistent with the rules of grammar, while the late closure says, where there is a problem of the attachment, make an attachment to the clause that is currently being processed. Ideally, assume that the current clause is the main one. Now let's take a look at how the minimal attachment operates. So sentence A and B, for example. Sentence A, the burglar blew up the safe with a rusty lock, while sentence B, the burglar blew up the safe with the dynamite. So if you could count the number of nodes that it takes to represent the intended meaning, it is the sentence B that has the fewer nodes. Also, the meaning makes sense since you can make use of a dynamite to blow up a safe, but it doesn't make sense to use a rusty lock to blow up the safe. Now we have here an example of a late closure theory. The sentence, for example, while Susan was dressing, the baby played on the floor. This sentence is ambiguous, and because of ambiguity, the late closure says that we can make an attachment to the main clause. So we have now the sentence, while Susan was dressing herself, The baby played on the floor. So our attachment here is the pronoun herself, redefining who is Susan. So Susan is the one who is dressing. The second model of parsing sentences is the constraint-based model. This model differs from the garden path model in three ways. First, instead of building one structure at a time, constraint-based parsers are capable of pursuing multiple structural possibilities simultaneously. The second difference is that garden path parser relies on word category for the formation of input, while constraint-based parsers draw on much wider variety of cues to decide what structure to build and the relative emphasis to place on each alternative structure. Finally, constraint-based parsers are often referred to as one-stage models because the lexical, syntactic, and semantic processes are all viewed as taking place simultaneously. Now let us go into the detail of the several types of constraint-based model. First in the list is the story context effects. While garden path theory says that the information appears in the preceding sentence should have no effect on the initial processing of a given sentence, story context effect uses the information in the sentence to make semantic assumption or a mini story based on the information given in the sentence. According to referential context account, a parser can use contextual information to decide which syntactic assumption or structure it will favor at a given point of time. Now here is an example of a sentence in a story context effect. The burglar blew up the safe with a rusty lock. Why would someone say something like this? Why add information on the safe having a rusty lock? So listeners make assumption that there are two possible safe, one that has a rusty lock and one that do not have a rusty lock. So a mini story is used to tell people ahead of time that there are two possible safe. So the mini story can go something like this. The burglar was planning his next job. He knew that the warehouse had two safes. Although one was brand new from the factory, the other one was sitting out in the rain for 10 years. Now the burglar blew up the safe with the rusty lock. Next on the list of constraint-based model is the subcategory frequency effects. As we can remember in the garden path model of parsing, that uses only word category information to make initial decisions about which syntactic structures it will build. But words can be more than that. As it is dynamic, it can provide more information. For instance, a specific category of words like verbs, while it can either be intransitive, which need not an object to stand, or the transitive, which contains an object, and the detransitive, which has both the direct and indirect object. Okay, let us examine the verbs took and put. While this belongs to the same category, which is verb, okay, aside from the different meanings, are these verbs equivalent? Now, let us look at the first verb, which is took. Okay, Dr. Phil took. What if we add a noun phrase after took, like Dr. Phil took a nap? So we conclude that the took is a kind of verb that needs a post-verbal argument. Specifically, took needs to have a direct object, as in this case, a nap. Now how about the verb put? Now let's have Dr. Phil put. Okay, the sentence is odd, and let's revise it. So Dr. Phil put a book. It's still odd. Now let's add something. We have Dr. Phil put a book on the shelf. So took and put are similar in that neither one can stand alone without anything coming after. But they are different in other ways. Took is fine with just a direct object, but put requires both a direct object and a goal. Thus, they are both in the same category, verb, but they belong to different subcategories because they have different requirements for different kinds of partners, sometimes called arguments or complements. Next on the list of constraint-based model is the cross-linguistic frequency data. Now, what is this cross-linguistic frequency data? Basically, whenever we consider parsing theories and strategies, the focus has been entirely on English. However, studies have been done in other languages that enlightens how people parse and interpret sentences. In line with cross-linguistic research that compares how different languages are processed, it is focused on the extent to which the structural preferences in different language match the frequencies with which the different structures occur in those languages. For example, Spanish speakers can use a relative clause to modify a preceding noun. Now, the study of Cutis and Mitchell 1988, they said that the sentence given below is globally ambiguous. So here's how it goes like. Someone shoot the servant could be a male or a female, of the actress who was standing on the balcony with her male spouse. Now, English readers prefers to attach the relative clause to the second of the two nouns. So the relative clause there is who was standing on the balcony with her male spouse. So the English readers attach this clause into the second noun, which is the actress. While Spanish speakers prefer to attach the relative clause to the first of the two nouns, which is the servant. So it means to say that the one who was standing on the balcony with her male spouse is the servant. While French speakers prefer to attach the relative clause to the first noun in equivalent to French, while the Italians and Germans prefers the second clause or the second of the two nouns. The idea that frequencies associated by groups of words are supported by the fact that a near exact translation of the same sentences have been used in different language or in different languages. So meaning to say, the Spanish have this background form of their structure that they prefer to attach the relative clause to the second of the two nouns. Our next type of constraint-based model is the semantic effects. Now we have learned that a constraint-based parser uses story context information and subcategory information in order to make assumptions to upcoming syntactic structure. Then another source of information that a parser could use is the semantic or the meaning. This could be in the sentence or the information associated with specific words in the sentence. And this is how constraint-based model differs from the garden path theory because the garden path states that a parser ignores semantic information in making its initial structural decisions. Now let's have an example of a sentence under semantic effect. The sentence that is called reduced relative. Now we have the sentence, the defendant, examined by the lawyer, went to prison. The sentence is reduced relative because it contains a relative clause examined by the lawyer that modifies the preceding noun, the defendant. Which defendant are we talking about? The one examined by the lawyer. The sentence can be easier to process if we introduce the relative clause with a relativizer. So the sentence will now look like this. The defendant, who was examined by the lawyer, went to prison. The relativizer makes the sentence unambiguous because it marks the start of the relative clause. In general, reduced relatives are difficult to process because listeners have a hard time figuring out what they are dealing with rather than something else. Now, another model under constraint-based is prosody. Prosody is defined as the rhythm, stress, and intonation of speech. This provides important information beyond the sentence literal word meaning. For example, prosody provides clues about the attitude or affective state. The sentence, "Yeah, that was a great movie," can mean that the speaker liked the movie or the exact opposite, depending on the speaker's intonation. There are two categories of speech patterns under prosody. First is the non-linguistic prosody. These are the aspects of speech that provides cues to the speaker's general mental state, and it answers the question, is the speaker happy, angry, or depressed? This will be initially identified by the tone and tempo of the speaker, and which also says the speaker's feeling at the moment. The second is linguistic prosody. These are the aspects of speech that provides cues to how the words are organized into phrases and clauses. For example, if someone says greenhouse, while if someone says greenhouse. So notice that the intonation can affect the meaning of a sentence. So someone might say greenhouse, it could be the house that is green, while greenhouse, this could mean that the environment of the house is full of green trees. Our last type of constraint-based model is the visual context effect. Visual context effect states that the information outside language processing system can influence syntactic parsing. Specifically, the information in the visual scene will increase the parser's preference for a complex syntactic structure. For example, the sentence, "The girl placed the apple on the towel in the box." To interpret the sentence as it was intended, comprehenders have to attach the prepositional phrase to the apple, as in, which apple did the girl place? The apple that was on the towel. So the towel on the apple now becomes the source. The apple on the towel now becomes the source rather than the goal location. So to further explain the concept of visual context effect, Tenenhus et al. Made an experiment that aims at finding out how the sentences has been interpreted by analyzing the eye movement of the participants. Now there is a manipulation of the visual display and the sentence to see how it impacted the participants' eye movement. So in the experiment, he illustrated there the two scenarios. We have the same sentence that was cited as an example, put the apple and the towel in the box. So the scenarios there are two towels, and the first one, there are two towels and one apple and an empty box. And the second one was there was two towels and two apples and one box. So as a result of the experiment, it tells us that the participants were making a more difficult structure or more difficult interpretation of the sentence when they see that there are two scenes that are being displayed. So that's how the outside scene or the visual view can affect our interpretation of the sentence. So to encapsulate all that we have learned about sentence processing, we knew that sentence interpretation involves a parser that makes decisions about how words in the sentences relate to one another. And we also learned that there are at least two existing theories of sentence interpretation or sentence processing. We have the garden path theory and the constraint-based. So we also knew that garden path theory is not at all times compatible with our human practices. So as a result of some studies, it is also favorable to use the constraint-based model of processing. That is all for my report. I hope that you learned something about sentence processing and sentence interpretation. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day ahead.